Okay, welcome back to another Bearded D20 walkthrough of the One Ring Magic Hack. Stress that this is a heavily modified variant of the One Ring second edition. My goal was to add magic to it, and then hours later, the system was unrecognizable. But it should serve as a pretty good alternative when everything is said and done for really running any old school adventure. Uh, I guess one thing I don't know if I've talked about in previous videos on this is I I want this to be the type of system where you can look at something like B2 or Caverns of Thracia or any old school adventure and just kind of use the bones of this system and then just start playing. And in the last video I gave some examples of how to use Theater of the Mind if you want to run kind of a short and sweet game and you don't want to get into the nitty gritty with grid-based combat. So I almost feel like I understand the argument for zones, but I personally I kind of like either grid-based and get into get into tactics, or just do Theater of the Mind and just be chill with it, like Dungeon World is. All right, so I wanted to make this video after the last one because as I was listening to what I talked about previously, I said I was going to talk about ranged combat, and then I just never talked about ranged combat. So I might as well get that out of the way first, and then also talk about some other mechanics here to continue fleshing out the system. And hopefully by the end of these, you'll have a decent idea of how to play. All right, so ranged attacks. All right, so when the PC makes a ranged attack check, so for ranged attacks, we're going to be using the marksmanship proficiency, and then once again, you can pick your physique proficiency that you want to use. I guess we could be a little bit different and use perform. And once again, just like the sword example in the last one, we'll marksmanship of 2, perform 1, 4. And I'm just using these values because this is going to be pretty representative of what you can get as a basic starting off character. All right, so we make our ranged attack, and ranged attacks have a different structure to them than melee. A ranged attack is assumed to hit a target and penetrate the armor. However, we'll go through the options the defender has, or the target of the attack has, based on successful, failed, and a crit. Because you'll see once we're done explaining these that ranged attacks are very powerful, but at the same time, there are ways to deal with them, and if you are prepared for ranged attacks, they're not as much of a threat as my statement just now may have made them sound. So on a successful attack, your target can spend 4 endurance to move 1 space in any direction they want to dodge the ranged attack. Let's see here. Okay, so you can move 2 or 1, sorry. You can move up to 2 spaces. And this is the target. And then if you fail the attack, Actually, I think this is actually a forced. Like you have to. Okay, I think I'm remembering what I did now as I reread my document here. So on a successful attack, your target they can dodge it basically by spending four endurance, and they have to be able to move two spaces in without backtracking in order to avoid the attack. So if they're in a cramped situation and they can't actually move two spaces, then they're stuck and you can move on to rolling armor. On a failed attack, which is basically, you could think of it as a successful defense from the defender's perspective, they only have to spend two endurance and they only have to have one free space to move. Now, in zone based, I'll come up with some guidelines for zones with this. But really, for theater of the mind, I think this will be pretty easy to kind of adjudicate how cramped you are in an environment if you're able to move or not. And then one option that both of these have is if you want to move an extra space, or really doesn't have to be an extra, it could just be you could do one movement here. And since you have to move two spaces for this to work, you could dive prone, and this would give you that extra one space. You'd be prone as the payment, basically, but you don't spend endurance for the diving prone. So you could move or you could move the two, and then you could move a third space and dive prone. And then for failed, you instead of moving one space and spending two endurance, you could just dive prone one space and not have to worry about it. And prone is a condition. We'll get to conditions another day. But it would give you advantage against future ranged attacks and disadvantage against melee attacks. So there could be situations where this is beneficial to you. But just the way the turn order works, being random, being prone, you might be prone for at inopportune moments, we'll put it that way. So that's that. And then for a crit, no movement. All right. So if you crit, if you get a 12 when you're attacking, or a lower number, but the stagger and threat range is such that you trigger a crit, then you hit. The target cannot move, no movement allowed, they don't lose any endurance, and you roll your armor. So we'll just move over here real quick. Or actually, in order to explain how ranged weapons are different also, let's go over bows and crossbows. So bows, size. Let's say a bow has a size of 6. Their armor penetration would be 3d6, since the armor pen equals 1/2 size. I'll see if I can avoid contradicting myself here. So I wrote down in my document here if it's rounded up or rounded down. Rounded down. Okay. So the 6 is a cutoff point. So if you had a bow of size 5, take the size divided by 2, the pen would be 2. So you need to be fairly strong to get a decent penetration on a bow. But even then, that's not the real advantage of bows, is that you can fire it without having a reload clock. So bows are good, give you range over the battlefield, and 3d6 pen for a 6 size bow isn't nothing, and 2d6 pen also isn't nothing either. So don't let the when you see the crossbow, don't let the bow's low pen dissuade you from using it. Alright, crossbows. And firearms will work more similarly to crossbows than anything else in the game. So let's say we have a crossbow that's size 6. Oh, right, crossbows. I might actually have to specify how the size relates to a crossbow. I might have screwed up on this. I know how to get the penetration. Okay, so I'll have to define or come up with a way to get the size of a crossbow. But the crossbow's penetration, when I wrote this, I was thinking the draw, basically how much poundage the crossbow takes to launch a bolt determines its armor penetration. So a hand crossbow, easy to fire, probably one of the scariest little ranged weapons in this type of universe. If you're not wearing thick armor, a little hand crossbow could be lethal, as any weapon in this game, since you only need to wound somebody once in most cases. PCs are a little different, we'll get to that. Most NPCs, one wound and they're down. So crossbows are based off of their reload value. So let's say we have a reload clock of 3. We get 2d6 armor penetration per point of reload. So this is actually 6d6 pen. And the way reloading works, reload clock. Number of allied actions. So the idea is this is turn order is very momentum based. So whatever your reload value of a ranged weapon that has a reload, it is the number, in order for you to be able to fire this again, a number of allied turns other than yourself have to pass, and then that weapon will automatically be reloaded again. And this is a way to, and with spell casting, this is also the idea of charging the spell when we get to magic later, also works on this mechanic of if your allies are taking turns, your allied clock is ticking. For enemies, they have their own clock, and the idea is just that when you have momentum, you can work on reloading the weapon faster. Now, I may change this to just raw number of actions, period, regardless of whose turn it is. But I think instead what I'm going to do is make this a feat that you can buy with experience points later to represent the difference between just a random peasant or an untrained person. Like, let's consider an example where you have a character where they've practiced with a crossbow or they've practiced aiming, so they have a good marksmanship score, but they haven't been in an actual fight in their entire life. And so the first time they get into combat, it's pretty scary when your allies are getting attacked and pounded and their shields are splintering. So that can be very stressful. And I think what I'm going to do is make a feat so that instead of it just being tied to your allies' actions, it's tied to anybody's actions, representing your ability to, you're accustomed to reloading weapons under pressure. So I think that's going to be the direction that this goes, and we'll leave this as the default rule. Because 66 pen, right now, I don't think there's a way to get a melee weapon easily that is this much penetration. Because I want weapons to feel different. And I want crossbows to be as scary as they actually are. And something like this that is a reload of 3, I think what I might do is make the size of a weapon times 2 what the reload value is. So this would be a size 6 crossbow as well. Because you do need to have strength to pull back the bowstring on a crossbow to reload it. And then I could probably add in like a crank loader, and that might increase the reload time, but allow people that are not the right physique to wield bigger crossbows. But that's beyond the scope of this video. Something to note, you might realize that if you set the reload to 1, you get an armor pen of 2d6. Let's see. Oh, sorry. Scratch that. You might be curious, what happens if you have a crossbow with 1d6 penetration? After all, if people can create custom weapons based on these values, then why couldn't you make a crossbow with 1d6 penetration? And that brings us to the hand crossbow. And the hand crossbow, even though your character does have to reload the hand crossbow, I'm going to assume that reloading a hand crossbow is about as difficult as drawing another arrow and notching it into a bow. Now, it's not exactly a one-to-one equivalency, but having fired both before, honestly, reloading a small hand crossbow, depending on how it's constructed, may even be faster than drawing an arrow and notching it and like actually lining up a shot. So I don't think giving a hand crossbow a reload of 0 is beyond the pale. And yeah, it gives you can have that kind of swashbuckling, sword in one hand, hand crossbow in the other kind of deal going on. And you don't need, even though this game goes into a lot of detail about certain things, I think worrying about what exactly is in your hands and being like, well, I'm holding a sword, but I have a hand crossbow and I need a free hand free to... No, it's like that type of stuff is kind of beyond the scope of what I want to do. So weapon is a reload of 0. You only need one hand to wield it. Your character can figure out a way while fighting to hold the sword and reload their hand crossbow at the same time. I trust that your character who fights this way is going to figure out a way to do it logistically with their hands and not have to drop or sheath something. Okay, so that's that settled. But I'll just remind people, even though this penetration value is huge on this crossbow, this is like an arbalist. Even if you had the hypothetical feat that only made this other people's turns, you're still waiting a while before you can fire this behemoth again. And up here, even on a successful hit, you're still only kind of quote unquote dealing 4 damage to the target. So this is kind of a case of, you may have a crossbow, but you may not always want to fire it at the beginning of combat when people don't have any stagger. So that'll be something I will be very curious to see how people deal with crossbows. If they go for the biggest, baddest crossbow they can carry, and this is probably going to be one of the bigger ones that people are going to be carrying at the beginning of the game. And 66 will, on average, shred through pretty much any armor that enemies are going to be carrying on them. So, but combined together, a bow user can lay down a lot of fire and build up stagger on targets. And so this creates some nice synergy for melee characters and ranged characters, since all ranged attacks don't really do a whole lot of damage the same way that melee attacks can do. And rolling a 6 on ranged weapons, you can't power attack with them, because ranged attacks, when you're protecting yourself from a big slab of metal, like a sword, you're using a lot of physical strength to do that. And although you can do it, it's taxing on you. Getting hit with a ranged attack, dodging it is way less taxing. But if it hits you, it's going to hurt. And that's why you need armor. It's just because ranged and melee weapons, they're different in real life, how you deal with them. And I wanted to have slightly different rules for how they behave to kind of reflect that and make them interesting. Because I think once people get the hang of the system, they'll have fun kind of hanging back with their crossbow. And then once something has a couple points of stagger, really going for that, like a maxed out roll with a ton of advantage. Because we'll get the charged attacks play into the ranged game. And I think when you see how those things line up, you'll kind of see what I'm going for with this, and how ranged weapons can be terrifying in certain situations. And before we get to charged attacks, I should probably talk about another way to defend against, or another thing that's going to factor into ranged attacks, and that is shields. So normally, in the last section when I talked about combat, and I said you could use any proficiency basically that made sense to defend yourself. Well, by default, you can't use weapon skills to protect yourself from ranged attacks. And so a lot of people are going to be succeeding their ranged attack just because it's hard to defend against them. So when you're shooting at a goblin, if the goblin just has some cloth armor and a little dagger on them, they're probably only going to be imposing one disadvantage on your ranged attack. So you're probably going to be succeeding a lot of the time. It's just a matter of how much stagger that goblin has and how much threat you can build up to get that critical hit on them so they can't move out of the way. But that's why I think this is so interesting, because you're succeeding a lot, you're aiming at them, but they're able to react to your aim and sidestep it. Shields change the game. Shields allow use. If you're wielding a shield, you can use any weapon proficiency that you have ranks in to defend yourself. So now, the goblin that just had a dagger and nothing else as a weapon, you give them a shield, now they can use their swords, and we'll say the goblin's skill they're using is athletics, just for simplicity. No, let's say, well, it's a goblin. We can't give it swords too. We'll give it swords 1 and athletics 1. So now the little goblin who just had 1 disadvantage on your attack, now he's throwing 2 at you. And the other problem with shields is that even if you hit, you don't roll armor penetration. You just deal stagger to the target. So in this case, like someone who is a shield, if you shoot them with a ranged attack, I don't want to say you don't have to roll, but you kind of don't have to roll. They just get a stagger. Well, unless you fail the attack. If you fail the attack, then they don't. So this creates a bit of a dilemma for ranged characters against people using shields. Because it doesn't really matter how strong your bow is or how powerful your crossbow bolt is, shield is going to stop it in its tracks. And since it's such a small projectile, it's not really going to do enough damage to the shield to really break it. I'll have to do some kind of research into that to see Because I feel like right now that's how it works, but I feel like something will probably have to change about that just because. But on second thought, I don't know because there were armies, medieval armies, that didn't use archers. They just used shields, just big tower shields, and archers just couldn't do anything to them. So it's something I'll have to look up on what sort of strategies medieval armies were using with ranged weapons to deal with people that had shields. And the critical hit on shield, we'll see how how that how I can make that work. Well, anyways, moving on from that, since I don't have an answer right this second for changing it, we'll move on to charged attacks. So a charged attack so every time an ally takes a turn, you can get +1 advantage for your next attack. However, if you have to make a check, then it's gone because you were distracted. So charged attack is basically aiming. And so melee characters probably aren't going to get to do this too much. They might, but for the most part, they're going to be getting attacked a lot because they're protecting people in the back. People that might be wielding an arbalist like this. So you as the crossbow character, you can sit in the back and just keep aiming. And every time an even is rolled, you can just pass and not take advantage of the allied turn, and you can just keep letting it pass to your allies. And in the case where you don't want to take your turn because you're charging up an attack, you can pass it back to someone and they can kind of go twice in a sense. So imagine you have 3 characters, and first character, 2 of them are melee, 1 of them is ranged with this crossbow here. So the 2 in front, first one goes, he gets even. The second one goes, he gets even. He tries to pass it to you, but you indicate, no, I want to continue aiming for advantage because none of the enemies have a lot of stagger yet, and I want to build up stagger or build up a sizable advantage pool big enough that I can get enough 6s without spending a ton of resources to get my threat up that high. So then that second character instead passes it to the character that went first. So that character goes twice, basically, if you think of it in a traditional round structure. Then auto switchback would occur. Then the GM would be able to activate and have an NPC make a check, or rather force one of you to make a check. And the GM now has an interesting decision to make. If they have something that even has the capability to attack the character in back who's aiming, or if they just try to kind of brute force down the people in front. And I think it kind of depends on the situation, but against a lot of creatures that don't really have great leadership, would probably just have one of the melee creatures engaged in melee with the other 2 characters attack one of them and force one of them to make a check. And let's say that creature goes and it rolls another even. Well, now it's the player's turn, and now the crossbow guy decides that he may have pushed his luck a little bit holding it. So he's held, he got advantage the first time, the second time, the third time. So he has +3 advantage on his ranged attack. So he decides to cash in and take a shot at one of the adversaries. And that's going to be a devastating attack. If you're using this example above for a starting character, 3d6 +3 advantage, now you're up to 6d6. And the enemy if they don't have a shield, they're only imposing, maybe 1 or 2 disadvantage on you. This roll is going to be insane. You're easily going to succeed it. And hopefully you get enough sixes or enough dice close to 6. You can burn resources to make them 6 to boost your crossbow's threat and get that crit off and possibly down one of them. And it's been 2, 3, 4. You're the 5th check of the round. So I don't know. I think that's pretty cool. You can, you really line up this advantage, taking your time, lining up a shot, perfect shot on the big bad boss in the back. And I think what's cool about it is instead of them getting worn down over time like they would with melee characters, the ranged character lining up the perfect shot, they can get that one-hit KO. And I think that's pretty cool. But they don't get it for free. They invested time into building up the advantage. So it's like functionally the end result is the same as a melee character wearing the boss down with repeated strikes that do a lot of endurance damage, but don't have the best armor pen, or what's the other thing? They don't have this huge advantage stockpile, so they're not getting as many 6s to trigger rolls to get a crazy threat threshold like you can on the ranged. And I think this makes ranged weapons feel different enough. Just the question sort of remains how to balance shields out with them, because right now shields are pretty strong, to say the least. Now that I think about it, I think one way to make the shield work is they give you that advantage on defense, or if the enemy's using it, the disadvantage from your regular weapon thing. And then on a successful or failed attack, if your target has a shield, they only lose half the normal endurance. So there's that. But then if you get a crit, then you still hit the actual person. You were able to hit them in such a way that they weren't able to use the shield to react in time, and you can still kill them. I think that is probably how the shields will have to be balanced. So the shields still give you there's a huge difference using it in the terms of how it feels, because you're losing less endurance blocking. It doesn't really matter if you succeed, if the target succeeds the attack against a shield wearer or not. They're not losing a lot of endurance. So it's really just a game of critting them so that they can't use the shield to absorb it. I think that's probably how I'm going to change it to make it work, because otherwise everyone's going to be using the shield, and ranged weapons will just be kind of pointless, and I don't want that. So, all right, enough of that. Let's move on to blasts. And so blasts, we'll use the let's see. We'll just use these two as an example for now. So the 3x line is 3 squares width, and then whatever your spell casting distance is long. Since spells are typically where blasts come from, but blasts I think will work for modern weapons extremely well. So imagine you're playing a cyberpunk game or a sci-fi game, and you have a semi-auto or fully auto weapon. You could make the attack a blast and make it a 3x line, where x is the weapon's effective distance. So maybe 3 times 9, 12, 15, 18, whatever. And anything in that thick line is going to be subject to the ranged attack rules over here. And so blasts are basically a different type of ranged attack, because when you get hit by a blast, the same things apply. If the blast attack is successful, then the target can spend endurance to move out of the way. And then you have that option to dive prone at the end. You know, now that I think these are supposed to be switched. Let's see here. On a failed hit, the target may spend. I think I got this backwards in my head. So forget what I said about confined spaces. I think this is what I had in my mind. So if you successfully hit the target, they can spend 2 endurance. No. Let's see. No, that doesn't make sense, because the successful attack, they're supposed to... Okay. Alright, I think I confused myself. It is supposed to be this way. But I guess that brings up a question. Which way do people think that should work? Can you move more on the failed? But basically the way... So, okay, so blasts do work differently. Because basically... so I need to add something to blast because it didn't specify for attack and defense. But basically, it costs 2 endurance to move one space to dodge a blast, and I think it is the same. So you can only move a maximum of one spaces on a successful blast hit, and on a failed blast hit, the target can move 2 spaces and spend, 4 endurance. Now I'm curious which way I had this. Yeah, okay, so I had it like this. So most blasts are not supposed to be super big. They're supposed to be you're supposed to be able to get out of them by spending 2 movement if you go the right direction. And the idea is on a successful blast hit, the person can move. Oh, I should probably put it in here. I don't know. I guess if people watch this, I'll let you guys comment if you think ranged and blast stuff should be tweaked in terms of if you have to spend 4 to move 2, or you don't have enough room to dodge, or if it should just be like both of these you spend endurance, but it's a different rate of endurance you spend depending on how many spaces you want to move to avoid it. Hmm. Yeah, I didn't put anything in this document for success and failure for blasts. In the document it just says cost 4 endurance or 2 plus prone to escape. Hmm. But I'm pretty sure I must not have been thinking right when I wrote that, because I think it's supposed to cost you a different rate of endurance to get out of the blast zone depending on if you succeed the blast or if you fail the blast. But I guess that's enough time dwelling on that. I'll think about it, and if anyone comments, I'll take those into consideration too. And of course, when I get around to playtesting, that'll be something to discuss with people, and we'll probably figure it out. And then the critical hit is kind of the same as ranged. If you critically hit a target with the blast, then they cannot move, and they are subject to the blast's consequences, whatever the blast consequences are. You know, in the case of the modern or cyberpunk example of semi-auto or auto fire, it's going to basically be a ranged attack. You're going to roll against you're going to roll the weapon's penetration versus their armor and see what happens. And then if you're throwing grenades or you have anything that causes an explosion, you just use the radius as your blast template. And so I think that's pretty cool for a how well this sort of just seamlessly flows into using modern weapons without really changing a lot. And then if you just want to fire a single shot at a target, then you just treat it as a regular single shot, like a single attack, single projectile attack, like a bow or a crossbow. And if I get to the point where I'm adding feats where, you know, you have like flurry of shots or whatever, rapid fire with a bow, you know, maybe the bow then it can briefly turn into basically a machine gun where you create a line, or you do rain of arrows. That's always a classic with bows. And then it could use a sphere, and then you're basically doing blast moves with a bow. Oh, I'll probably add it in. I think that stuff's cool. Uh, yeah. And then armor. So PC armor. So PCs have a D6 armor pool, and this is true for all defenses, but we're just going to talk about armor. And once you know how the armor defense works, the other three work the same way. So you have a pool of D6s based on the armor you're wearing, and then it's versus a static NPC penetration value. And I'm basically giving the NPCs the benefit of chance. So if, for example, a sword, let's use the bow. So the bow in our other example was 3d6 penetration. If this was an NPC bow, you basically give it 4 points of penetration per d6. So this would be 12 penetration. So I want to give the NPCs the benefit of the advantage curve a little bit to... I think it'd be a little bit too annoying to alternate between 3 and 4 on the average of a d6 to give it a true average. So I'm just erring on the side of making them a little bit better than 50% for both their armor and their penetration. So in the case of, it flips then when we have NPC armor is going to be 4 points per kind of the same thing in reverse. So if our PC is wearing armor that provides, and then they have a helm that provides 1d6 for a total of 4d6. This is what happens when I get tired. NPC equivalent. $16 armor. So this should kind of give you some ideas about what you're looking at on rolling on the d6 pools for penetration versus armor. And this check, since you're on, if this was a game where you had to make this check every time you were doing like HP damage, I think this would be really annoying. But considering NPCs in general have a single wound before they go down, and in rare cases we'll have two, and then we'll get to large creature wounds in a second. I think this is a nice little check, and it adds a lot of tension, because this determines whether or not your weapon is sharp enough and you're lucky enough to get through that armor and actually wound them, or the vice versa. You know, if your d6 pool can hold up to the enemy's attack. And so you can see if you're rolling 46, chances are you're going to roll above a 12. So if you're getting shot with this large, the size 6 bow is on the large side. So chances are you're only looking at 2d6 penetration, or 8 NPC penetration is going to be more average for a bow than 12. So getting an 8 on 46, or even 3d6, shouldn't be too ridiculous. So against kind of your bog standard enemies, odds are in the PC's favor in this case, just because of what type of weapons most lower level NPCs will be using. But then that will change drastically for tougher NPCs and bosses, and PCs that are not wearing a lot of armor for whatever reason, maybe due to load constrictions, or they want to use their loadout, their load for some other type of defense boosting, and they're trusting other PCs with good armor to kind of take the brunt of those types of attacks. You know, you could easily end up with a PC that only has 2d6 armor, or even 1d6, but that'd be pretty risky, but it could still happen. But 3d6 plus a d6 helm, this is pretty standard for kind of a mid-weight front-level fighter. 46 would be pretty normal to see. So that gives you kind of an idea, a more concrete idea of how armor works. And just in case this part wasn't clear, when you're attacking, if your penetration value is higher than the NPC armor, so if we have the 3d6 penetration versus the 16 NPC armor, we need to get higher than this value, and then we score a wound. Vice versa, if we're attacked, the PC makes our 46 check against the penetration check of the NPC's weapon. If our armor meets or beats the penetration value, we're good, because the penetration value has to be higher than the armor value. Wounds. PCs. Alright, so if you as a PC become wounded, you can keep fighting, but you automatically gain 1 stagger no matter what you're doing. Whenever you have a turn, you get 1 stagger. And you're automatically weary. So your stagger, you're gaining 1, it can never go down. It doesn't matter what your endurance versus load is. Losing a stagger or gaining a stagger is the same mechanical effect as bleeding. So this is to represent, like, you don't have a lot of time left. Gaining 1 stagger every single round is terrifying if you can't lose any of it, because you probably already have some stagger at this point, and now you're gaining more automatically in addition to every other incoming attack. So every hit that's coming in, if you're just rolling insanely well and you're not rolling low enough for the GM to trigger another armor penetrating check on you, Or even if you are getting armor penetration checks, but your armor is now rolling better than it did when you got the wound, you're gaining tons of stagger. Eventually, you're going to max out pretty quick, I would imagine, at 11 stagger. And at that point, you're incapacitated. And then if you don't get treated medically after this, like immediately after the encounter's over, if I don't know why a party would, but hypothetically, if everybody's wounded and everyone maxes out stagger somehow, then I guess that would be a way a TPK could happen in an unlikely scenario. If you're wounded again while you're in the wounded state, you're dead. Your body can't take that much punishment. There's a little bit of plot armor assumed here in that the PCs can sort of keep pushing on a little bit. You have a bit of a clock once you've been wounded, but that second time that comes in, it's over. You're done. And then large creatures. The way I think large creatures can be very interesting All right, so what this means, let's just use a dragon. Let's just go straight to a dragon as an example. So, head, 1 wound. Body, 1 wound. And then we have, we could go into detail on the dragon, because why not? Left wing, right wing. We could do tail. We're not going to worry about the back claws, because the dragon's going to be using its hind legs to keep it stabilized, just as the PCs are. But we could worry about the left claw, right claw. So this should intimidate you, but not necessarily in the way that you think. You don't have to wound the dragon in every single body part to kill it. If you get a head wound, it's dead instantly. Doesn't matter how many other body parts it has. It's done. I think the body would inflict basically the same condition that PCs have when they've been wounded once. If you wound the body, it's not instantly dead, but it becomes weary, and then it continuously gains 1 stagger every time it has an action. So it's on the clock, and this could be a way to kind of increase that, if you're having problems where the dragon keeps recovering from stagger, wounding the body so that it can no longer, it becomes weary. You could think of it becomes weary by law. It doesn't matter what its endurance is at this point. It's bleeding out. So it's weary, it's gaining stagger, it can't recover stagger, it's on the clock. This is a good way to kind of set up going for the head if you're having trouble actually rolling well enough to hit the head. And so then what you can do is you can impose 1 disadvantage to any attack that targets the head or the body for every other unwounded body part. So in the dragon's case, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So just from this, we're not even taking into account proficiency of the dragon. Just from the body parts alone, we're already layering on 5 disadvantage. And then if we add in the dragon's proficiency, you know, the dragon might have, hypothetically, 3 proficiency in natural weapons and another, you know, 2 proficiency in athletics, hypothetically. So you're looking at a total of 10 disadvantage. We'll just move wound tables out of here. So 10 disadvantage to attack the head or the body. You're not really, you're basically fishing for 12s at this point. And it's possible, I guess we'll find out in playtesting, if something like this causes people to not try to play the minigame of defeating the body parts and just try to fish for crits and then spend a bunch of resources. But I would like to think that if this is set up, if this is like a normal dungeon crawl, and the players are burning resources at a decent rate, and they get to the bottom, and there's this dragon waiting for them, that nobody's going to be in a position to feel comfortable burning the last bit of their resources to just roll a d12 with, you know, 10 disadvantage. They're not going to have any d6. They're probably not going to be able to overcome this 10 disadvantage with their advantage pool. That should have been drained by the time they get down this far. And if it isn't, and they played very cautiously and or risky and conserved their advantage pool to burn it all, because they'd be burning all of it for one single Hail Mary roll. I think that's kind of cool. If a player wants to try to sort of cheese the system in a way, they've already paid for it in terms of opportunity cost by not spending their advantage pool to make it easier to get down here. So if they pull something like that off, your group's going to be raving about it for forever, and it's going to be a cool moment, and ultimately, what are we even doing here if not for moments like that? But anyways, I think you can kind of see normally how this encounter would go is if you go for a wing, a tail, or a claw, then you're only dealing with 5 disadvantage, which is still bad. So you're going to need to do things like you're probably going to have to kind of stagger this thing and have characters aim for body parts to build advantage. And so you basically have characters sort of protecting one guy in the back, either charging a powerful spell using the charged attacks rule, because this is going to be one very powerful way to overcome kind of overwhelming disadvantage like this. Now, there's another factor here too, is that the kind of starting characters that have, you know, 3d6, these characters are most likely not going to be fighting something like this anytime soon. And they'll be using the progression system to boost those dice up. And so there's a possibility that they would have 4 or 5 base proficiency to kind of cancel out this disadvantage and at least bring them to a bit of a more level playing field. Because let's say, for example, if you had a character and your marksmanship, we'll say your perform is 2 and your marksmanship is 3, and so now you're up to 5d6. Well, now if you encounter this dragon that imposes 5 disadvantage on you, you're still rolling 5d4. You haven't lost any dice because you're able to tie it. So even though it's not ideal because you can't get any natural 6s for trigger rolls, at least you're in the situation where passing your check isn't an issue. So you're most likely going to be succeeding. It's just a question of how much focus and gravitas is the group going to spend to kind of boost trigger rolls to get to the point where you can start wounding these wings and tails and claws in basically one cycle of characters. And what I mean by a cycle of characters is you have one character go in and attack, say they go for the left claw. One character goes in, attacks the left claw, doesn't kill the claw or doesn't wound it, but inflicts stagger on the left claw. And yes, I believe the stagger should be tracked separately for the different body parts. Just because I think if you don't track stagger separately, you could get into a case where people just attack these to build up stagger and then just attack the head without actually wounding any of these things. So I think you have to build up stagger on each body part individually. And maybe you group them, like maybe the wings are one group that share stagger, and then like, I don't know, the claws share stagger, and then maybe the body and the tail share stagger. It's just things to think about of how to structure this. So anyways, so you go after a claw, you stagger it, then the next player goes, they do something, they also are able to kind of stagger this thing, and maybe they have a hammer, so they inflict extra stagger, and now two PCs have gone. We now get to the third PC, and maybe they have a crossbow, or they're casting a spell, or maybe they just have a big weapon, and they move in and they roll, and they get their big hit in, and they manage to wound this thing. Now you've brought the 5 bonus down to 4, and eventually after you take out some of these things, you may be in a position after wounding a wing and a claw and maybe the tail, you've brought this down to 7 disadvantage, and now the prospect of going for the body may not be as daunting as it once was, because now you're losing 2 dice off of your roll. So now you're down to 3d4. You still have d4s though. So it's not taking out your entire roll, which if you had the 10, then it would be 0, and that would be bad, because then you couldn't get any trigger rolls. So there's that to ponder. And of course, you could make large creatures that have far less body parts than this, but I think as a template for how to construct large creatures, this is how I would do it. Every large creature, other than, weird things like oozes, and I think oozes would probably just work in a system where they have a lot of endurance, but oozes, you can't wound an ooze. And so in those cases, the only way to beat an ooze is to reduce its endurance to 0. And I think that could be fun if you're fighting something that has like 2 or 3 times the amount of endurance that a normal creature does. And so then characters who do a lot of endurance damage are just hyper effective at tearing through oozes. I think that'd be kind of a fun way to deal with them. And real quick, I'll note on my ideas for undead, but just finishing up on large creatures, I think this is a good template for it. Head, body, give it a number of body parts that make sense in addition, and then each body part gives attackers a disadvantage to going after the body or the head. So players have to kind of play this mini game about which body part do they attack, which one are they afraid of. Do they want to go for the wings on the dragon so it can't fly anymore, or it can't flap them together to create a gust of wind knocking everyone around? Do they go for the tail because the tail can like sweep and hit a whole bunch of people and cause problems? Or they go for the claws? It gives people choices to make instead of just a big bag of HP that you just burn through. And then lastly, wound tables. This is kind of an optional idea for rolling d12s. You could also roll like 1d12 plus 2d6 or whatever, and make a table for different wounds. And I guess one interesting thing I just thought of with this, you could actually just leave this xd6. You could make it so that when you're wounded, and this is just something I'm thinking of off the cuff. Uh, However much stagger you had when you became wounded becomes the number of d6s you roll with the d12, and then you roll this pool of dice, and you're rolling on a big table for different wounds. And so the lower in the table you are, the less severe the wounds are. And then the higher up in the table you go, you get all the way up to things like losing an arm or a leg or whatever. And then that way, PCs could function totally different from NPCs. You wouldn't worry about this anymore. This would be gone, and it'd just be replaced with the wound table. And then, as you accumulate wounds, eventually you're going to roll high enough that you're just going to die. And so I think that's an interesting thing to explore down the road, kind of once the game is more complete. And then I guess I'll just end this real quick with Undead. The thing with Undead is I was thinking when you attack them, they gain stagger, but Undead never lose endurance. So you can never make an Undead weary. They can always recover from being staggered. So I think that makes Undead very scary in a different way by using existing mechanics in a thematic way. So things that build up threat range and focus firing Undead, and anything that can build up a lot of stagger at once. And if you've been paying attention to these, you've probably already guessed that that's the hammer. On 6s, hammers can generate extra stagger in addition to the stagger that they deal from the base attack. So in that way, hammers, as tradition calls for, are the ultimate undead killing weapon. Even though they do a lot of endurance damage, that doesn't matter in this case, because hammers are also good against armor in a different way. But yeah, I hope that that was interesting, and I will leave this one for now as well. Bye.